Attitudes towards the Soviet Union and Russia are ambivalent. On the one hand, there were many positive aspects, such as guaranteed housing and employment. On the other hand, there were significant problems, especially during its final 2 decades. People are still arguing whether the Soviet Union was a great civilization, a level of achievement that can never be regained by modern Russia, or a totalitarian state doomed to collapse. In Ukraine, opinion on Soviet Union is simple. It was pure evil, a communist occupation without any good sides. Of course, other opinions existed, but they were suppressed after 2014. Now in Ukraine, it's not even possible to ask whether the Soviet Union had any positive aspects. Ukraine is fighting its Soviet past, dismantling the monuments, renaming the streets, and even cutting down trees that were planted in the Soviet Union. When I saw this information, I thought it's a joke or propaganda, but no, it isn't. Of course, that was the only one case, but it represents the hate towards Soviet Union. Ukrainians hate the Soviet Union because there were closed borders, a complete lack of personal liberty, and troubles for anyone who expressed an opinion that disagreed with the government. This seems familiar. In this video I want to speak about the role of Soviet Union in Ukrainian history, about Lenin's Ukrainization, about Golodomor, because I'm surprised that many people really believe that it was Stalin's plan to get rid of Ukrainians, and of course about the Soviet legacy in Ukraine. Let's start from the very beginning, 1917, the year when the Russian Civil War started, and both Soviet Union and Ukraine appeared on the political map. Ukraine had never been an independent state before. Of course there were Cossacks, but they functioned more as a mercenary military organization than as a sovereign state. To say more about that Ukraine, I need some context. Civil war in Russia was very chaotic. After the Russian Empire collapsed, dozens of different powers and armies appeared. Anyone could round up their friends, grab some weapons, and declare their own state. The Red Army of the Bolsheviks was more or less united, while the White Movement consisted of different groups with conflicting agendas. There were many interesting states like the communist Donetsk Krivoy Rog Republic, or Makhno's Free Territory, where Batyka Makhno tried to establish an anarchist society. Speaking about Ukraine, there were two main powers, Communist Ukrainian People's Republic of Soviets, UNRS, and UNR, Ukrainian People's Republic. There was also a Ukrainian state, Ukrainska Država, but it was just a puppet of Germany. That time is very chaotic, so I won't be talking much about details. There were a lot of Ukrainian communists, but UNR also had many supporters. There is an interesting book about that time, White Guard. The author is Mikhail Bulgakov, a writer who was born in Kiev, and in this book he said some interesting things about the Ukrainian language. He didn't like Ukrainian state for forcing people to learn a language that he considered artificial. And despite Bulgakov was born in Kiev, now Ukrainians dismantling the monuments to him in his home city and trying to cancel him. Speaking about the attitude of people towards the sites in the Civil War, there was a joke in Odessa. Avos are winning. And who are Avos? Those who are winning? As a result of the Civil War, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was established. Its capital was in Kharkov, and its borders were a subject of extensive debate. According to one initial proposal, parts of the Don region, including the city of Taganrog, were to be incorporated into Ukraine, while certain districts of Chernigov and Sumy regions were to remain part of Russia. Meanwhile, Western Ukraine was part of Poland. Soviet government decided to promote Ukrainian culture and Ukrainize the land that was given to Ukrainian SSR. Sometimes Ukrainization was kind of forced. People who didn't learn Ukrainian language had troubles. Here are some articles from Soviet newspapers of that time. As you can see, people who didn't learn Ukrainian could lose their job. They also couldn't join the Communist Party. And as you can see, many people didn't want to be Ukrainized. If you want to read these articles, you can pause the video. And I'm sorry if this automatic translation looks ugly. And this is what the chairman of the Supreme Council of National Economy and the Council of People's Commissars of the Ukrainian SSR, Vlast Chubar, said about Ukrainization in October 1924. Again, if you want to read the full text, you can pause the video. Our entire practical work on Ukrainization must be divided into three parts. The first is the introduction of the Ukrainian language in everyday life, in schools, in institutions, etc. The second part of the task is the development of culture, literature, and so on. And the third part is the involvement and promotion of Ukrainian personnel. Later, in 1930s, Ukrainization was cancelled, but still from a report sent to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine in 1938, we learned that there were 21,600 schools on the territory of Ukraine by that year, of which 18,100 taught in the Ukrainian language. By comparison, there were only 1,500 Russian language schools, 12 times fewer. Also, Soviet government renamed the cities after Ukrainian historical figures. For example, Khmelnytsky city was called Proskurov until 1954, a name it had held since the times of the Russian Empire. However, the Soviet government gave the city the name of the famous Ukrainian Hetman, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. A similar story happened with the city of Stanislavov, which was renamed Ivano-Frankovsk after 1962. There were also hundreds of villages and small towns named after Taras Shevchenko. Now probably the most sharp topic, Golodomor, a large-scale famine that happened in 1933. It was a tragedy, millions of people died, and my family also suffered from it. The problem is that it's recognized by Ukraine and numerous other countries as a genocide of the Ukrainian people, orchestrated by the regime of Joseph Stalin. It was always a hilarious statement to me because Russians and Kazakhs also suffered from it. Famines also occurred in the territory of the USSR in the 1920s, affecting various regions, not only Ukrainian ones. The Soviet government attempted to carry out collectivization, to socialize all food sources and food itself, in a country that still hadn't recovered from the civil war. This can be considered the Soviet government's fault, but it wasn't done intentionally, rather it was a mistake, and crop failures didn't make it better. Don't forget that Bolsheviks also tried to help the population. And neighboring countries like Hungary and Poland also experienced famines these years. Here are several eyewitnesses' accounts of the aid provided to the victims of the 1932-1933 famine. All of them are from Ukrainian sources and they are being presented as a proof of genocide. There are many people who say that it was a planned genocide, but at the same time they mention crop failure and that Soviet government distributed food. You can say that it's the fault of the Soviet authorities and inefficient governance, but it's very strange to call it a planned and engineered genocide. There is no proof that it was planned, not a single report or document, let alone the fact that the USSR attempted to solve the problem of famine. Now a few words about Stalin's repressions. I don't want to talk much because this video is about Ukraine, and Stalin repressed all nationalities equally. Of course there were a lot of Ukrainians sent to labor camps or even executed, but there were also a lot of other ethnicities. It was a totalitarian state, what do you want? Repressions targeted a wide range of people. Intellectuals, scientists, military commanders, those who fought in the civil war for whites, and often even those who fought for reds. In the Ukrainian narrative there is the term the executed renaissance. It's named for Ukrainian writers, artists, intellectuals, and cultural figures who were persecuted. But you know, there were enough of Russian cultural figures who had the same fate. Now let's finally talk about something good. The industrialization and 5 years plans, пятилетки. Soviet Union had almost no industry, and it was necessary to solve this problem. One of the most famous objects built during 5 years plans is Azovstal in Mariupol. Just imagine, it took only 3 years from the construction decision to the first steel being produced. Or another industrial project, Dnepr gas, a massive hydroelectric power plant on the Dnieper River in Zaporozhye. It was a flagship project of the Soviet Union's first 5-year plan, and became a powerful symbol of Soviet industrialization and technological ambition. Construction works started in 1927 and were finished in 1932. I was very impressed when I saw it, and I really hope that someday I'll see it again. A few days ago, 10th of October, Russia helped Ukraine with decommunization, so Dnepr isn't producing the electricity now. But I'm sure it will be repaired one day. I'll return to the topic of infrastructure a bit later. The next important topic is World War II, or if we are speaking about the Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War. Unfortunately now there is an opinion, especially in Russia, that most of Ukrainians fought for the Nazi Germany, which isn't true because there were more than 7 million of Ukrainians in the Red Army and only 250,000 of Ukrainians on the side of Germany. There is also a popular misconception. There was a Ukrainian front in Berlin in 1945, and many Ukrainians are saying that only Ukrainians were fighting there. And they say this seriously. They doesn't seem to care that the fronts were named after geographic locations and that their names weren't changed in 1945. The name Kursk Front also doesn't mean that only residents of Kursk fought there. After Germany was defeated, the Ukrainian SSR received a lot of land. Western Ukraine, which had been Polish, Hungarian Transcarpathia, and Bessarabia. And the capital of Ukrainian SSR was moved to Kiev. There was a Ukrainian immigration which mostly consisted of collaborators, but I don't see much sense in talking about it. They left Ukraine and had no connection with Ukrainian people, so who cares? Now let's return to the topic of infrastructure. Almost everything in modern Ukraine was built during the Soviet era. This includes all power plants and the atomic ones, as well as all industry. Even the Dnieper Donbas and Seversky Donetsk Donbas canals, which supplied water to the entire Donbas region, were built then. I really hope that soon they will be back to work. I'm not even talking about the old Komi blocks, which are still the main housing in Ukraine. And all of Ukrainian achievements belong to the Soviet era. An-Tu-25 Maria, which Ukraine is very proud of, the biggest plane in the world, was made in Soviet Ukraine. It was supposed to transport the Soviet space shuttle Buran and components of the Energia rocket on its back. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in 2022 when Russian forces captured the airfield and Ukrainian army shelled them. Of course, Ukraine is promising to restore it, but unfortunately I know how projects are carried out in this country. Speaking about Ukrainian culture in Soviet Union, I have tons of old Soviet books in Ukrainian. There was also Dovzhenko Film Studio, which produced movies in Ukrainian. And now I want to talk about the main reason for Ukrainian hatred towards the Soviet Union. Late Soviet Union was a very bad place to live in. Of course, there were some advantages like housing for everyone and no unemployment, but the state was rotten to the core. People didn't believe in ideology anymore, but since it was still a totalitarian state, it was impossible to talk about it to not get yourself in trouble. Some talk for the kitchen, others talk for the street. There was also a shortage. Sausage was a rarity. There were huge queues for bread. That period seems like a real dystopia, and many Ukrainians who remember it associate all of this with Russia, even though modern Russia has nothing to do with it. It's a different state. In Ukrainian narrative, that was Russian occupation, despite Ukraine had many communists, and Brezhnev, one of the leaders of the Soviet Union, was Ukrainian. Stalin also wasn't Russian, by the way. And Russians in Soviet Union faced the same problems as Ukrainians. I don't really want to make a conclusion. There were a lot of positive sides, a lot of negative sides. It depends on a person's worldview. For some, freedom of speech and individual liberty are important, while others admire the Soviet Union for its space program, well-developed science and industry. And people will argue in comments anyway. The only thing I want to say is that denying your past is a huge mistake, whatever it may be. You can't change history. Hope this video was interesting. I want to remind you that you can support me on Boosty by the link in the description.